Following presentation on learning modalities as instruments in the symphony of instruction, tuning up students with learning differences, will be presented by Heather McCoy, who is a classical Lutheran home educator to 3 scholars and 1 graduate. She is currently a special needs instructor with the Center for Students with Learning Differences at Scole Academy, a school of classical academic press. Please welcome me, Mrs. McCoy.
Good morning. It has been a minute since I've spoken in front of a live audience as I work at a virtual school, so I'm just going to picture you all on a computer screen in little boxes. So, all right, well, it is an honor to be here to present with you this morning and talk about how we can use learning modalities to help students with learning differences thrive under our instruction. And I just want to can everybody hear me? Okay? Awesome. Great. So I am a wife to a pastor, a mom to 4 kids, a home educator, and a teacher with a passion for helping students with learning differences. During my 20 years as a teacher, I served in public education, home education, including co-ops, American Heritage Girls, and of course my congregations. My current position with Classical Academic Press as a special needs instructor allows me to meet with students one-on-one via Zoom to meet their unique instructional needs and develop strategies to help them overcome and manage the challenges that come with their specific learning differences. All right, so what is a learning disorder, disability, or difference? We have 3 different words that we use, but they all mean the same thing. In a psychological setting, you'll hear disorder. In an educational setting, when talking amongst faculty and support staff, the term disability is often used. And then when talking to students and parents, you might consider using the term difference. The variance in terms is just situational vernacular. Using the word difference in place of disorder or disability when talking to students and parents about how to overcome their learning challenges. The word differences is just more friendly, and it might avoid negative feelings that complicate the efforts to alter instruction for the student. So in my experience, when a student or parent receives a diagnosis, it's not a surprise because they stop testing for a reason. But it can be a bit of a gut punch. Many parents experience guilt and wonder if they did something wrong during prenatal or early childhood. So while using the word difference doesn't change anything about the student's abilities, it does tend to soften the grieving and unwarranted guilt and then moves the family closer to acceptance, which puts them in a more stable posture to support their student and for the student to be open to learning just differently. Okay, so in order for an individual to qualify for a diagnosis of a learning disorder, he or she must meet the criteria of having a persistent impairment in reading, written expression, and/or math. Some students you work with will struggle, but they might not meet the criteria for an official diagnosis. This may be due to their challenges not being persistent enough, or there might be an environmental factor causing temporary learning challenges. This can be anything from the effects of poverty to a traumatic event, such as the death of a family member, being involved in a serious accident, or even a long-distance move. It could also be due to a medical condition, such as epilepsy or a traumatic brain injury. So in these cases, you're looking to rebuild skills, whereas in the case of a learning disorder, the challenge is always going to exist for that student. So they need to find different ways to access and process the information that you present. So just to give an idea of just like the frequency of challenges you might see, here's some 2023 statistics. So 1 in 59 children have one or several learning disorders. 33% of kids with learning disorders will be retained in grade. Kids with a learning disability have a 31% greater chance of being bullied than students without disorders. 18% of kids with a learning disorder will drop out of school, and the average dropout rate overall is 6.5%. 43% of parents want their child's learning disorder to remain confidential. And 81% of the time, adults with a learning disorder will not disclose this to their employer. So there is some shame that's involved with learning differently. But that's one of the things that we can start to fix. All right, so just so that we're all on the same page here, there are some common neurodevelopmental disorders that you're likely to see in your schools and homeschool rooms. Those of you serving homeschoolers may notice a higher percentage of learning disabilities because working in my job is working at a school that serves homeschoolers and then being part of a homeschool community myself. It's not uncommon for parents to remove their children from brick and mortar schools because they aren't able to meet the needs, or even worse, they're mistreated. So, after I go over and just like briefly explain these, I'll take questions if you need anything clarified. The first one up here is autism spectrum disorder. It's a broad range of conditions that are characterized by challenges in social interaction, repetitive behaviors or thinking, and restrictive behaviors or thinking. Individuals with autism are likely to seek sensory stimulation or avoid sensory stimulation. It's probably the most adverse disorder because, as the name indicates, it's a spectrum. ASD is usually accompanied by some other disorders on this slide, as well as chronic medical conditions such as GI issues, seizures, sleep and eating disorders, and mental health conditions. 1 in 35 children are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Next up is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is well known, but generally poorly understood. This is characterized by poor attention management, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Poor attention management is the inability to focus on a given task or subject, unless it's something of high interest. In that case, they'll hyper-focus and can lose hours and hours of time going down this rabbit hole of whatever caught their attention. So, and then hyperactivity displays in the need to move often. And here it's important to note that it's more common for a boy to be physically hyperactive and display like pacing, tapping hands, feet, fingers shifting in the seat and all that, and wants lots of large motor movement. On the other hand, it's more typical for girls to be mentally hyperactive, which is that rapidly moving attention through several thoughts in her head. When a girl is doing that, like my daughter, you can see like that deer in the headlights will come over, or it looks like they're calm, paying attention, but she's planning her next D&D campaign, pretty sure. So impulsivity is evident when you see them act without considering consequences. So it could be something dangerous like jumping off the roof of the house into a pool, or not so dangerous like agreeing to fulfill responsibility without considering if they have the time and resources. You might also notice impulsivity in their verbal responses. They might come across as rude or disrespectful, though that's rarely their intention, because kids with ADHD tend to be people pleasers. So for ADHD, the average age of diagnosis is 7 years old, and 11.3% of children between the ages of 5 and 17 have an ADHD diagnosis. All right, so then we have visual, auditory and visual processing disorders. These ones aren't as common. So these are difficulties in processing the information that's received. For auditory processing, in addition to not remembering verbal information or instruction, these students may have trouble following multi-step verbal instructions, ask you to repeat yourself, and be distracted by background noise. 3 to 5% of the school-age children have an auditory processing disorder. And then visual processing, they'll have difficulty tracking information like on a worksheet or a graphic organizer. They might have trouble locating items in your classroom, in your home, in whatever learning space you have, even though it has been well established and you've told them so many times, they can't see it. So 5 to 10% of school-age children have a visual processing disorder. All right, so then we come to the specific learning disabilities. This is a subcategory of neurodevelopmental disorders. And the 3 main ones are dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia. A student could have difficulty in one or all of these areas in addition to anything above. So dyslexia is an impairment in reading. Individuals with dyslexia find reading to be taxing and exhausting. You may notice younger children are unable to break words into syllables and match the sound to the symbol of the letters. Older children might display poor spelling way beyond the age you would expect them to have mastered spelling rules. These students are likely to enjoy listening to literature when they are not expected to read out loud. You might also know these students remember much of what they hear, but little of what they read. So 20% of students are diagnosed with dyslexia, making it the most common language-based learning disability. Then we have dysgraphia. It's an impairment in written expression. It might include difficulties with grammar, and when writing a composition, they might struggle with clarity and organization. These students have trouble putting their thoughts into the written word. And I personally found they do really well when they're allowed to dictate. And this impacts 7 to 15% of the population. And then dyscalculia is an impairment in math. These students have trouble making sense of what numbers mean. The numbers are an abstract concept. They're on the operations, they're even more confusing. So when I work with these students, I have to find an interest, and then I pair that interest with the numbers. So it could be shopping or dividing food among friends are the two most popular ones. This one impacts 3 to 6% of the population. So these above disabilities here, they do not impact the intelligence of the individual, which just makes it really frustrating because they know that they can do it. There's just this barrier that they can't knock down in between them and their potential achievements. And then finally, we have an intellectual disability. This is like limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive skills. Individuals with an IQ of 70 or lower are considered to have an intellectual disability where the average neurotypical person has an IQ of around 100. So adaptive functioning skills are what they need to just function independently in society, like basic academic, social skills, and the ability to manage money, their personal care, etc. Okay, so are there any questions about what these are? Yes.
I would just add that there are kids who kind of get caught in the middle here between intellectual and learning disability. If their IQ is above 70 in the 70s and 80s and they're performing at or above level, they cannot qualify for any of this unless they have like an ADD or something like that. So as a title teacher, I see a lot of those kids because they cannot qualify, but I'm allowed to pull them for title. And that can be very difficult because they're performing at, say, a 78 level and their IQ is 75, they're not going to qualify for intellectual disability, but they can't qualify for learning disability because there's no discrepancy. They're performing above what they're supposed to perform, but they're sitting in a class that's being taught up here.
Laws are frustrating, aren't they? And public policy is a whole thing. I loved public education because of things like this, where it's just, do you check the right box? No, you don't. You are right under this line, so sorry, we can't help you. Like, this is absurd. So this is why we are all blessed to be outside of that. And if you have the resources in your learning environment, you can address those needs for those students. So, thank you. All right, any other questions about disability? All right. So as instructors outside of public school arena, we have freedoms that they don't. For those of us who homeschool or do a combination of co-op, cottage, or virtual with home education, we can make any changes necessary to meet the needs of our kids. Creating an equitable environment is easy once you know what your kids need. So for those of you who are in brick and mortar Lutheran schools, it's a little more challenging. But as I hope we'll see over the next few slides, catering to learning modalities really just comes down to intentionally good instruction. Okay, so learning modalities. The reason you're all here, right? So we all have our preferred avenue to receive information. One or two are likely more comfortable than others for you. Most people have a primary and secondary learning modality, and they might switch depending on what you're learning. but you're likely to lean on one more than the other. So I'll use my own learning experience here. So I was diagnosed with ADD when I was 17. And then I was evaluated a year ago as an adult. So the psychologist affirmed, yes, you have ADD. And I'm like, yes, I knew that. And then he added this verbal sequencing disorder, which that was new. It's like, that's a thing, great. But then all of a sudden, I had this reason for the immense amount of effort it takes for me to participate in meetings without an agenda, lectures without slides. And then I realized that this hymnal-loving Lutheran really missed the slides from a contemporary-leaning home congregation because they put the sermon highlights on the slides, and it was easier to follow along. And then as a pastor's wife, I get to preview the sermons to make sure they make sense. And that's how I was able to follow along, because I read it first. So I am not advocating for covering up pretty stained glass with slides, but I don't know, maybe slide something in the bulletin. It could be all right. All right, so I need to exert the least amount of effort when I pair my primary modality of visual and my secondary modality of tactile. So I learned to adapt auditory information through note-taking. And when I can't take notes, I create images in my head that represent the auditory information. And then when I have to adapt kinesthetic information, like those BBS songs, I just follow a leader or that one kid up front who knows all the things, right? So as instructors, when we incorporate all the learning modalities, we give our students an example of how to use each one in a variety of subjects and activities. This fills their toolbox with strategies, which results in higher confidence and independence, which is more likely to lead to a love of learning. And that's really the goal of all our instruction, right? Because we want them to value the true, the good, and the beautiful lessons that we teach.
Is interactivity, like interaction between those in any particular category, or?
I mean,
You can read, you can talk, you can watch, but is the learning involved in interactivity? No.
I don't think I understand the question, sorry. Like, what do you mean by
Is there another category of interactivity besides visual or audible?
Well, I mean, you can interact with all of those, especially, auditory, that's special. So we're gonna get to each one of those though, so I might answer your question. All right, so when the learning environment incorporates all learning modalities, every student in your class will benefit. So we all have our preferred ones, but the difference between students with learning differences and those without is the necessity of using those modalities. So students without learning disabilities will probably find it easier to adapt to their non-preferred modality, while those with learning disabilities, they'll be stuck at the bottom of that snowy ramp without using them. Their learning modalities aren't simply non-preferred, but are often not operational, undeveloped, underdeveloped, and in some cases just absent. With like a profound visual processing disorder, profound dyslexia, severe ADHD, to navigate a detailed map can be comparable to asking a student in a wheelchair to ascend the stairs. But just like all students can use the ramp, all students can benefit from a map that layers the details or spreads it out over several pages rather than crowding everything on one sheet of paper. I live in Michigan, so I grabbed a Michigan map. So we're gonna use this map just to illustrate my point here. So simple maps that are categorized by type of information rather than one map crowded with all the information your student needs to know about the location are more efficient for both the student and your instructional time. Reformatting these maps helps your student who struggle with processing, distraction, and attention to navigate the map because there are fewer symbols to identify and filter for the information that they need. For all the students in your class, the categorized presentation helps to train their brain in preparing to analyze the relationships between the different aspects of the map. For instance, if you wanted to analyze the location of major highways in relation to landmarks and waterways, providing the categories gives them the visual cues to find that information in the future and shows what needs to be filtered out when given a map like the one on the left. This is reasonable, right? We're like, yeah, obviously, give them a simple map. The thing is like, it's so necessary for the kids who have learning differences. Let's talk about black and white for a second here. So we know it's easier for students to find information when the presentation is simple and clear. So another formatting feature to notice is the use of color in the original files. The simple maps use limited color, while the crowded maps use many shades of blue, green, and white. So when you're making black and white copies, the variance in the color on the map on the left is a disaster of just tangled information. The one on the right, copies without shadows and fewer grayscale variation. So again, just intentionally good teaching and realizing the impact it has on students with learning differences. Another one here is to making the map fill the page. I did both of these on your standard 8.5 by 11. So 2 maps on one page versus 1 map on the full page. So I know we all want to be good stewards of our resources. But when you have students who are highly distracted or have visual processing challenges, you end up wasting ink and paper because they can't use the resource you give them. So instead of crowding 2 maps on one page, put them on several pages. Alright, so when you pair clean visual materials with well-paced auditory instruction, you've already covered 2 most prevalent of the 4 main learning modalities. So now we're going to take a look at how we can use all of them in the symphony of your classroom. Alright, so first what you want to do is figure out which modalities your students are leaning toward. And this way, you're going to use your instructional time most efficiently. So as you start to note the preferences of your students, so my challenge to you is to remember what they don't choose, because that option is what causes them to use more mental energy. For a struggling learner, that energy is limited. For instance, like the choice between reading a book or listening to an audiobook. If given the choice, a student chooses the audiobook every time, that's an indication that reading text takes a lot of energy. And since not everything is available as an audiobook, the student is conserving that mental energy for the times he has to read instead of listen. So having conversations with your struggling students is a really important investment. Knowing they have a teacher who notices what they like, cares about how they learn, takes the time to notice them, goes a long way in building a trusting and supportive relationship in a space that is often, or historically for them, full of failure. So asking about the home learning space is going to tell you a lot. If the student is productive, scholastically successful from his home learning environment, then it has the needs. If he's not, then he probably needs the opposite. In either case, you have a chance to partner with parents to figure out how to best support this student. And if you are a parent at home, this is hard, I know, because you kind of have to step outside of that and almost see it as you're looking at an arena. It's kind of how I would explain it, and just watch what happens. It's really hard to see the nuances when you live in it all the time. So as you get to know your students at the beginning of the year, you're probably noticing these things already. Maybe it's causing you confusion, or perhaps you appreciate these as quirks that add to the student's charm. But using these observations to adjust your instruction will tune up those students who depend on their primary and secondary modalities for their education. All right, first step is visual. All right, so we're going to look at the different modalities, how to use them in your classroom, and how to avoid some pitfalls that come with them for students who struggle with distraction and maintaining attention. Okay, so the two most common modalities of visual and auditory are easiest to implement during classroom instruction, and often the ones that instructors will lean on. Totally fine. But I've seen them become like mundane and underutilized. So let's look at ways you can get a little bit creative when implementing these modalities. So here is an example of how I use visual cues to help one of my students with dyscalculia remember the operation and sign to use when adding positive and negative integers. She and I worked together to make this exactly what she needed, and she's 16. So she was like old enough to know her brain enough by then. So color coding, symbols, consistent sizing with the different kinds of symbols, and this organized table, so she knew where the boundaries are between different pieces of information, were all things that helped her. So you probably already use your board or presentation when you explain a new concept. So to get the most out of this modality, try using a variation in the font color to indicate different categories, you know, if you're doing a presentation, or different pens if you're writing on a board. This could be like parts of speech in grammar, sections of an essay, components of a paragraph, whatever different sections you're doing. When you're annotating literature, give students the option to use small sketches rather than the typical arrows and question marks. You can put a box around or frame key information, just kind of like here, because that helps them draw their eye in and focus on what's in that box. Explore sketch notes. You guys heard of sketch notes? There's a book on Amazon if you want. They're pretty great. It's almost like Cornell notes, except draw instead of respond. And then there's this group called Visual Faith Ministry. There's a bunch of free visual resources. They would be great for those of you teaching Bible or at Sunday school. And it's the Michigan district's former president's wife is the one who founded it. And so they even have like 3-year lectionary bulletin inserts and stuff. So definitely check them out. Okay, and then always remember to show and tell instead of just tell. So it's natural with math. You know, you go through the process, but just remember to do it with the other subjects as well. Students with a strong visual learning modality who also struggle with attention, it's important to adjust the environment to minimize unpredictable distractions. This is generally as simple as a seating arrangement. So his or her back is to the window, or closing the classroom door so they can't see the people walking through the hallway. If you're at home, like I am, you might find a corner with low activity, or you create a school zone in your home during your school time. So in my house, my kids like to do their schoolwork at the dining room table and in the living room. Since both of these places are kitchen adjacent, they're high traffic areas. So what I had to do is just like change the rules for that zone during the day. So the TV does not come on until after our school hours. The curtains on our front window, they're closed, so they're not distracted by cars and stuff going by. Okay, so any questions about visual modality or brilliant idea you want to share?
What was that website, Sean?
The Visual Faith. Yes, that one is, it's visualfaithmin.org. I have a resources thing too that I'll link at the end of this, and I forgot to put that one on there. So.
Visual Faith.
Min, M-I-N, yeah. So like short for ministry. Yes.
Is there some significance with the doodles? It was mentioned on that other screen. What is the significance of the doodles?
So that's like as a visual learner myself, when you have an image or a symbol or an icon that you pair with the information, it's easier to remember. So, for instance, one of my students with dysgraphia, when she annotates, we abandoned the book guidelines for annotating, and for happy, she decided to do like a 3D exclamation point, things that she thought were interesting or exciting, things that troubled her. I think it was a cloud with rain coming down. And so, because that's what made sense to her. That's what her brain associated with that category of information. Any other questions? All right, so next up we have auditory. So the auditory learning modality is another super easy one to incorporate in your regular lessons. If you're teaching at a school, it's probably a solid 75% of your instruction already. For homeschoolers though, this is a little more challenging depending how many kids you have and how much your child does independently. So jingles. All of our grammar level stuff, we have lots of jingles and songs, like an abundance of them, right? But they tend to stop around 3rd grade. So when you have those older kids who still respond to jingles, I just put a beat to it, and they are going to tell you you're cringe. And there will be eye rolling, and it's okay. Just let that go. Secretly, they're really going to appreciate it. And then those like key words such as keep, change, flip when doing when dividing fractions or any other like those short keywords for other lessons. Those are nice and repetitive so they'll remember it. Discussion. Discussion is golden for those auditory kids. So if you want to combine like a few different learning modalities, maybe have the auditory kids, carry the burden of the discussion, and then have those visual kids take the notes, and then provide the summary. And so, I'm not suggesting that you do this all the time, right? Like, they all need to dabble in all of the different kinds of, learning. But if it's a review, or maybe you notice that you're doing an informal evaluation, or that the morale is a little bit down and everybody needs to just kind of sit in their comfort zone, it's a great time to pull this out. So that way the kids can shine in their comfort zones. You get a more accurate measurement of what they know. It builds confidence, and then it lowers competition because everybody's natural gifts are recognized and appreciated. So some things to do to help your auditory students review your instruction at home would be providing audio recordings of the jingles. And if you're doing a beat, just record it, it's fine. Nobody cares if you can carry a tune or if you can keep a beat for longer than 3 beats or whatever. Just the parents especially will be so happy to just have it. Provide the lyrics for the keywords. Let them know they keep, change, flip. So that way parents can reinforce that at home. You might even consider to record yourself during instruction just for those key concepts. I know that can be uncomfortable, but it's okay. Even those 5-minute sections, just kind of like they have at Khan Academy, And if you're I'm not recording myself, it's not happening. There's plenty of teachers on YouTube. Go find one that is pretty close to what you do and have them, suggest they use that. And if you're working at a virtual school like I am, you probably record your lessons anyway, so you're set. Okay, so any questions or things to share about auditory modality?
I just have something that I do in my kindergarten classroom to pair the auditory instructions with visual. So I have little laminated cutouts of school supplies like pencils, crayons, scissors, glue. So I'm explaining to them what you're gonna do, but I'm also putting those little cutouts on the board to help them remember, because especially in kindergarten, there's a lot going on. So that's just something that I do to help with the instructions.
That's great, and that actually connects with annotating. with those like different icons and images that make sense to the student. So you're laying a foundation for annotating a book, and you didn't even know.
Great.
Yes.
Well, I had one child that really struggled with, background noise and auditory stuff. So like, whenever you're just giving instructions at the home, and especially in the classroom, you have to physically touch him every time, just get his attention. Even saying his name wasn't enough, because he can't hear you until you've gotten his attention a different way, because otherwise he'll miss everything.
That's probably more of a distraction. Is that you? Yeah. Even like one of my kids, she's the one with ADHD. She has headphones that she wears. So we talk, the headphones go on, she goes off into her world, and then I make sure she's not hyper-focusing too much. But then she's able to be more productive because she blocks off all that auditory stuff. We ready to go on? Yes.
I'm wondering if singing in the classroom would fit under auditory or kinesthetic learning, because it does engage your whole body, but it's also auditory, or is that a combination of
That'd
both?
be a combination.
Okay,
Yes, keep doing
Okay.
that. That's really good.
okay.
Kinesthetic, here we go. Okay, so kinesthetic learners love large motor movement when they learn a new skill. So to provide these opportunities in a classroom requires a really solid foundation of classroom management, because you're going to have kids moving around. So in this picture, I was helping my daughter, who has undiagnosed, but I'm sure she has dyslexia. We're on the list to get evaluated. I was helping her untangle those vowel blends that she's having trouble with. So what I did is I just used sidewalk chalk on our driveway, and I wrote the blends around, and then I said a word, and she had to jump on the blend. This was 4 years ago, and we did it a couple of times, and I've done other things. This is what she remembers. So you can incorporate large motor when like sorting information into categories in your classroom. So you can like divide your board. Let's say you're reviewing which character said what quote. So like divide your board into sections, put the character even better, like a picture of that character. Hand out some quotes, have them come up and stick the quotes under the character. So they're standing up, they're moving, they're holding something, they're physically putting it on there. And so there you go, you have visual and kinesthetic right there. Another thing you can do is, those, that icebreaker game where you have a ball and there's like questions written on it? And whatever your thumb lands on, that's the question you answer. Put review questions on the ball. And they can toss it. If you have good classroom management, make sure that's in place. But, that gets them up, it's moving, it's, and then that's also nice because you're like, okay, I have 2 thumbs. I like this question better. So it can kind of like lower that anxiety. All right, so anything to share or questions about kinesthetic? Yes.
I'm just like laughing because my Mr. 6'9" son, we used to do clean and learn. So literally he would clean my cabinets. In fact, they're suffering terribly right now, but would clean the cabinets, and I would talk with him about history and different things like that. So even putting that kid, I'm a classroom teacher as well, and putting that kid to the task of, hey, I need you to separate these things or divide these books up or prepare something for something coming up, then you can do that over here almost as a leader of the class, and then, that sort of thing. I found that effective over the years too. But yeah, the clean and learn was awesome for me. I have to just joke about that.
So if you are at home or you have a student in a school or you are a classroom teacher, clean and learn. That's amazing. Your house gets clean and your kid reviews what they need to learn. Best idea ever.
I have a question.
Yes, you.
For kinesthetic, does that always have to incorporate movement, or would things like, say they don't like sitting at a desk and prefer to sit on the floor or lay on the floor or a beanbag chair or something, would those get qualified into this category too?
I think so, because it's a sensory feedback for the whole body. So I think with how they sit, that tends to be more of like an occupational therapy, like in that realm. And that's kind of like knowing where they are in space. And a lot of students who are on the autism spectrum don't know where they are in space. And so often you'll see those like rubber bands around the legs of their chair because they need something to ground them. Or my friend's son, who is like a toothpick, and he's like this tall. He has pretty severe ADHD. He can like wrap himself into a pretzel. And, like, it's the weirdest thing. But he's really happy. Yes.
I'm wondering if, do you work on, like, if the things I'm able to do for them in second grade, like not sitting at a desk, do you help them develop tools that they can use that are like less noticeable as they get older? Because I think especially the classical approach, like if you there's a big push to use like desks looking forward instead of sitting on the ground with a clipboard or in a beanbag chair, things like that. It just feels like opposite sides of, I don't know, the guide we're supposed to use or something. I don't know.
So if that is what's required in your learning environment, there's a couple of things you can do. There's these things called wiggle seats, and they're about $25 on Amazon. I actually use one on the floor at my desk, and they're just like these little, it's like an exercise ball, but flat. Okay? Yes. Exactly, you know what I mean? Yes. So they have like spikes on one side, they're soft spikes. And so if they need that, that sensory input for their feet, so you can either sit on it, and they, like I use one for my daughter because her core wasn't developed, she did that W sitting. So I had her sit on that so I could develop her core, and then she could sit up straight. You can also put it on the floor for that, putting those exercise bands around the front legs of the chair, and they put their feet on that, and so that gives them inconspicuous, I'll say.
Another idea to help with that is to consider standing desks, which are not always popular. Graders, everyone is at standing desks. And then as they mature, they have the freedom, they can wiggle while they're there, and they move then and sit on the rug or move to other classrooms or whatever. But then the standing desk just allows the feet to move and they can wiggle. And as they're older, I've seen students, they'll go over and they'll look out the window for a bit and they come, but you could tell this young man was listening the entire time. He just needed to move and have that bit of capability and autonomy. So when we can give them agency with a desk like that, that's an result.
Yes.
I'm genuinely confused.
Okay.
Why would we add sensory inputs with a wiggle seat when we're simultaneously removing sensory inputs from maps?
Okay, those are two different sensory inputs.
But they're sensory inputs.
Yes.
Wouldn't you want to reduce the noise floor completely? Drop band.
Not for all students. So like that wiggle seat is silent.
I'm not talking about,
Okay.
I'm talking about the number of inputs. A student needs to be able to focus on the clarity of the message that you are teaching them.
Yes.
Wouldn't it so if you need a clear map, that's great. But if a student doesn't like the feel of the shirt that they're wearing, you would do something different there. Why would you increase a sensory input with something like a wiggle seat? I'm confused.
Because it helps kids focus, some kids focus.
If
By
that's,
increasing distraction?
Yes, because their sensory input, yeah, sorry.
go ahead.
I'd like
You go.
I'm gonna attempt to answer.
Okay, go ahead.
So sometimes, and I'm just gonna speak for myself
Okay.
and for what I've seen with students, but also like there is energy that needs to get out.
Why?
In order for my brain to focus. And as an adult, I've learned how to do that constructively. So I've learned to take notes. So in the sermon, you'll always see me taking notes because it allows even if I never look at it again, it allows the energy to get out of my body. And so while the energy is getting out, my brain can absorb. So what I teach some of my students is if you need to get some, like you can play with your hands behind your back, because just getting that energy out a little bit lets me take in what the Lord has for me learning. And so sometimes when I think of it as energy, if I'm focusing all of my personal energy on holding still and paying attention, it's taking me so much effort that I am missing every treasure that's being offered to me, because it's taking more effort than you can imagine just to sit still. So, but finding ways to do that in any environment that are not distracting to others, that are not noticeable, that is a key skill that has to be learned. And so while I might say, like, I don't want a wiggle seat, because I don't want everybody to notice that I'm, like, that might not be what I would prefer. But finding a way to say, yes, in order for me to take in, I also need to let some things out.
I kind of get it.
Is that
It makes some sense, but at the same time, I've got some energy right now from the fourth cup of coffee I've had this morning, and I'm actually concentrating very hard on getting my pen to be still so I can read my own writing. So I'm trying to direct it in opposite direction. I'm sorry, I'm very jittery right now.
You're fine. So, the next slide is tactile, and I think that might round it out and help.
Please do.
Okay.
I did that my last idea.
Yes.
Just, I don't know, I did talk about all that skip counting, forever the skip counting, but we were at home, but we had like a really long 100 counting, like where we physically took the steps. So I'm saying when the kids are gonna every day, especially different kids in different ages, that they were like skip counting physically, and you just need to break in chair too, you know. So I wish in classrooms you could have this like I'm just charter outside, you know, because stepping through it helped a lot of kids. That's true.
So if you're in the school where they're like, sit still, tell them to paint that on the playground. Take them outside. Okay. So the last one here is tactile. So tactile is often combined with kinesthetic, but I think it's better to separate them when we're talking about this, because you have small and large motor movements. And there's a difference between the sensory input of movement and the sensory input of touching. So tactile learners do very well with manipulatives, as do kids who practice calculator. So those of you who teach older students, use those manipulatives from the lower grades. Your tactile and dyscalculia kids will thank you. So like I worked with a 5th grade young lady who has dyscalculia. Fortunately, she had the same Matthew C manipulatives that I did. So we used those, and like light bulbs just started going off for her. So her mom asked her classroom teacher if they had manipulatives, and they're like, oh no, we stopped using that in about 3rd grade. And I'm like, get manipulatives back in the classroom, go and get them from the 2nd grade teacher. So if you have them, keep them when your kids are older. And if you don't have them, go borrow them or get yourself a set, because they're still helpful. We talked about annotating. So annotating while reading helps those tactile kids to learn the information when you teach it. So personally, as a visual tactile learner, I didn't have to study my notes until I went to college. Because I remembered as I wrote, because I could see it in my mind, and I was writing it down. So pairing those two things, like I remembered it. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to study when I got to college, so that was kind of the thing. So please teach your high schoolers to study before they get to college. The first few years were a little rough. All right, fidgets. We love fidgets. We hate fidgets, right? So the right fidget's amazing. You'll see a difference right away. The wrong fidget will leave your student and everyone around them distracted and frustrated. So choosing the right fidget can be trial and error. The first thing to do is observe your student to see what he or she is naturally gravitating toward. then you can see what's beneficial about what they're reaching for and replace it with an appropriate fidget that meets the same need. So I had a student who had braids. So she would fidget with her braids, and then she'd see her braid. And then she'd feel herself pulling on her braid. And that's like way too much sensory input. So what I figured is that, okay, she's going for tactile. It's the texture of her braids. So I said, find fabric, find sandpaper, those common strips, these textured strips here. These were the winner for her. She just put one on her desk and she would just like touch it as she talked, and her productivity like went way up. She was getting the sensory input she needed and it wasn't distracting. Then when I noticed she started playing with the braids again, like, where's your strip? She's like, oh, I lost it. She replaced it, all of a sudden the productivity went back up again. So I have this link on the resource page that I'll link at the end here, but this therapy shop is awesome. It has a million things that are all categorized by type of sensory input and quiet ones. So that's great. Okay, so any questions, scariness about fidgets?
I was just trying to say, one of the things that I've used is like sticky back Velcro right in the desk. And so they are underneath of the table and they can just reach down and feel it. And then it doesn't get lost because it's stuck to the desk.
That is good, and I know like here they have things that stick on the desk that have like different kinds of textures that hang off, and so, yes. Anything inconspicuous and quiet is good. Okay. So I am being cognizant of time, so I'm just gonna go ahead and skip this one. All right, so. Yes, you can incorporate all of these. The ideas that we've shared today, they're not groundbreaking, right? And that's kind of the point, is that you don't need to do wildly inventive things to help kids with learning differences. You just need to be intentional about incorporating the different modalities and then combine some things that you're already doing. Audio and visual, arguably the easiest modalities to consistently utilize in the classroom. Kinesthetic and tactile are often commonplace for the grammar levels, but then they tend to wane as the students progress into the upper grades. So bring those back. So knowing your students' primary and secondary learning modalities, it gives you flexibility. So if you have a learner with a primary modality of kinesthetic and a secondary modality of auditory, then they'll learn, they'll lean on the auditory for the instruction, or kinesthetic just as the practical. But you can communicate with the parents if you're at a school, and so that they can do the kinesthetic part for the repeater at home. All right. So older students, giving them an opportunity to reflect on their learning experience, like what made this easier, what made this harder. So that gives them an opportunity to kind of own it, and it moves them towards independence so that they can then apply these things later on after they've left you. So celebrating the different ways we learn and how we are fearfully and wonderfully made, part of God's symphony. Each instrument has a unique sound to bring, and so do your students. All right, so as promised, here's a few of my favorite things. So if you're not loving QR codes, that's totally fine. You can just grab one of my cards here and email me and I'll send you the file. So this has the links to the resources that I have that I'm going to just mention. And like I said, that visual faith ministry, I did forget to put that on. I get all of these notifications from my drive. Yeah. Yes.
So what do you think about allowing students to have food or drink in the classroom? I'm going to be teaching part-time through 5th graders for the most part next year. And at that school, the upper level students are allowed to drink tea while they're working. And I think that's really useful as it's sensory and something they can touch. But I'm kind of not, I don't you maybe know, I don't think they do that for younger kids just because it's messy. But I don't even think they have water bottles in the classrooms, and I don't know, like, would that be useful? What are your thoughts?
I think it depends on the students.
Okay.
You know, we're talking about not every student is different.
Okay.
Right. And so what could be really helpful for one is super distracting for another. Just like the annoying t-shirt. Probably doesn't want anything tactile to touch. But, you know, they might have another thing where their energy, like, thank you for putting it that way. I love that. Where they have that energy that needs to go out. Using another kind of fidget or seating arrangement like that. So if it's going to be distracting, which it probably will in the lower grades, just because their dexterity is a little questionable.
Okay.
But
That could be
if you
something
find
useful for older students.
What's that?
That could be useful for older students.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I found, like, for myself in college, it helps to have tea or water as I'm in class.
I'm confused about something else. So a lot of what you've covered here is very similar to the things that I was learning about in college 20 plus years ago at state school, state education school. But since about 2006, there have been many papers published poking holes in the idea that learning modality-driven instruction does not statistically significantly cause or bring about better learning outcomes. So we talk about classical education in terms of curriculum, and we talk about it in terms of pedagogy. So my question is, if this is what was being pushed in progressive pedagogy 25 years ago, what makes this classical pedagogy and what changed?
I think it's just how you do it. And so, like, here, my focus is on students who have learning disabilities and learning needs, right? They need it because they have an absence of skills in their brain, right? So overall, it's probably not effective, okay? However, if you're incorporating these learning modalities to help the students who have learning disabilities in your classroom, it's also going to, it's not going to hurt anybody, but it's going to be like a lifeline for them. And when I work one-on-one with students, that's the first thing I do is figure out how do you learn? How does your brain need to access this information? And if they cannot access it by reading because they have dyslexia, well, then I'm putting down the text and I'm talking to them because they have to get it somehow.
I had a similar concern as this gentleman as well, if anybody's read the work of Dr. Dan Willingham. So he talks about what we think about is what we learn, and that your learning modality is going to be task specific, not individual specific. So it depends upon what you're doing. So I've seen this taken to an extreme. I'm a dyslexia specialist, and I had a teenager tell me that he doesn't have to read the words because he's kinesthetic learner. Well, you can do kinesthetic things, while you're reading, but at some point you have to read the words. Now, if you're talking about content, that's different, right? We're talking about skill versus content.
Yes.
You can learn content in all different ways, but if it's a skill of reading, which they do have to do, even though they should definitely be listening to those books on tape, yeah, to show my age, to all that, they should definitely be getting content elsewhere, which I always tell the teachers. But I feel like what you're saying is to come at things like in a multimodal way, so that kids can get them. I think it can be taken to an extreme, and there is, he's right. There is a lot of stuff out there about not overdoing it. I'll tell you, when I went to school, we were doing that intelligences, Gardner's, and we were doing like however many intelligences, so this was in the 1990s, however many intelligences you can fit into a lesson, you get more points. Well, it's completely wrong and completely not classical, right? Because what you're not focusing on what you're supposed to be focusing on. But yeah, I think that, that's what I was thinking of too, but I do understand what you're saying about focusing on, or having them use the modalities that's gonna work for them.
Right, so, I mean, there's one approach where it's like, here's the information, like you're saying, skill-based. This is all individual-based. And this is about like, this is how their brain functions and this is what they need. Those, like building those stepping stones between them to, because sometimes those pathways between them and the knowledge they get, they're non-existent. They're not there. So part of these, like, using what they're good at, their natural skills, is building that pathway. And I know it is like 11:30 right now. So if you are up, I'm not ready, but I have a table down there. Please come to me if you have any other specific questions. We are hosting a live learning event through my school. Dr. Amy Richards has a book coming out, which is all about forming in a classroom, like constructing your classroom to be welcoming to students with learning differences. And so myself and my colleague Angelique will be on the panel with her on Thursday evening. Notice this is Eastern time, we're in Central, so that'll be 7 o'clock for us. It's 10 to 10 live. Please do register and you'll get a report.